Tune in for Series 5 of the Hip Talks, a podcast series of discussions on legal issues hosted by Hugel and Ip Solicitors, an independent boutique law firm in Hong Kong, providing bespoke legal services and exceptional client service to individuals, families, entrepreneurs and businesses, both locally and internationally. The forthcoming podcasts are the Barrister series. Over 6 episodes, the team sits down with preeminent Hong Kong barristers to discuss contentious issues related to civil litigation, employment, family, trusts and estates, as well as increasing awareness about the importance of the role of barristers in court proceedings and the relationship between solicitors and barristers when acting for clients. Hugel and Ip provides expert advice across a variety of dedicated practice areas, both contentious and non-contentious. An outstanding team of solicitors who have achieved exceptional results and recognition in the areas of dispute resolution, probate and trusts, family and matrimonial, corporate and commercial, and employment and immigration. Hugel and Ip applies modern thinking to legal services, uses technology in a contemporary office environment, and is fully committed to giving back to the community.
Hello and welcome to this podcast series. I'm Caroline McNally and I'm the head of the family law team at Hugel and Ip Solicitors. I'm delighted to be joined by barrister Frances Irving of DeVoe Chambers. Welcome, Frances.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you for asking me.
Frances and I have worked together on many cases over the last 10 years, which we're going to talk about. But let's start at the beginning of your career, Frances, because something that we have in common is that we haven't had conventional career paths. And although I believe that your father wanted you to be a lawyer, you took a different path. Can you tell me about that?
Well, I think probably lots of teenagers who are told by their fathers they should be doing something will decide to do the exact opposite. And I was probably one of those teenagers. But I suppose it was because as a child I was considered to be quite argumentative. But I was the third of 3 sisters, so that was my job, to be argumentative. And at university, I did a general degree of all sorts of different arts things and then went on to train in social work, which I was studying for 3 years after my university degree, and then continued to work in social work in Edinburgh before I came to Hong Kong. So it was some years later that whatever Dad had said to me back in the day had begun to take root, I suppose, and I ended up with a second career.
So do you think your father was ahead of the time? Because there were many female lawyers at that time?
As far as I was aware as a child growing up, and it was a small Scottish town, the lawyers, the accountants, the doctors, they were all men. My dad had ambitions for all of us, me and my sisters, to be professionals. So to that extent, he was ahead of the curve. But I suspect probably he wanted a lawyer in the family because he got free legal advice, and an accountant because he'd have free accountancy. And at one point he had his eyes on the butcher's son, I think, to provide his business with cut price produce. But he was an ambitious person himself, and both of my sisters had inherited that, I think. My eldest sister is still running her own business in London. The other one runs a business with her husband. So none of us are shy of working, if I can put it that way.
And you certainly seem to have a sense of adventure in your family, because I know that in 1975, you moved to Hong Kong with your husband, Terry, which must have been a very big adventure back then. Had you ever even been to Hong Kong before? I
had not, but he had. He had worked here some years before. And it was just literally an adventure, a 2.5-year adventure. And Hong Kong had never seemed to me a strange place because my mum was here straight after the war with an army unit, and she'd always spoken about it. So it was something that was part of our storytelling when we were growing up. So when we were coming for 2.5 years, that seemed like a grand plan. We rented our flat in Scotland, told my job I was coming back, and off we came to Hong Kong. Never to return, actually.
It's a familiar story.
It is a very familiar story, particularly of that era when my husband came out to work in a role with the government. And it was a 2.5-year contract, rolled over every 2.5 years. And the first tour that we were here, our children were born. And then we became a family in Hong Kong, and that sort of seemed it. We never even discussed going back. Hong Kong is now home.
And you've been here nearly 50 years.
Next year will be 50 years, yes.
Obviously, somewhere you've got a great affection for.
It's home. And people ask what's it like to live there. And I say, well, probably the same as it's like living in Edinburgh, but the weather's nicer. And it's a great city. they're great people, the Hong Kong people. It's a good place to live. And you have that same experience.
Yeah, my
Hong Kong
background
growing
is
up.
quite similar.
Yes, yes.
And I often wonder what would have happened had my parents not moved to Hong Kong for their 2-year stint.
Of course. And I wonder the same thing. Would we be in the suburbs of Edinburgh now, as opposed to living in a fabulous city like Hong Kong?
I mean, I think that I probably would not have been a lawyer.
Oh, do you think that's interesting? Why that?
Because I don't think that the opportunities would have come their way in the way they have.
I mean, I agree with you. I wouldn't be. I'm quite sure. I would have continued to be a social worker, which was a great job. I would have continued to do that in Edinburgh, probably. And I suppose diversified a bit within that profession. But I doubt very much I'd have gone into law. I don't know. It was an opportunity that arose here because I was working as a social worker in Hong Kong, had been doing my job for 15, 16 years in adoption for the social welfare department. And I saw an advertisement in the paper for a law course at the university, Hong Kong University, and I thought, I think I'll do that because the kids were older. They didn't need me at weekends. This was a weekend course that I could do while I was working. So I did it, just really out of interest.
But you weren't planning at that stage, were you, to actually become a barrister?
I was not. I was not at all. I was planning just to do something away from husband, children, dog, house at weekends, doing something different on my own for a change. One evening a week and one afternoon a weekend. And it suddenly evolved, really, to now.
Yeah, I was going to ask you what changed, but was it something that just was organic and it just evolved?
To an extent, yes. But this was I did my law training in the mid-90s. I was working for the government at that time, and it was a great job. I loved my job at social welfare. But there was a great push for localisation. And I can see that although I loved that job and I'd been doing it for a long time, social welfare couldn't use me anywhere else, only adoption where they had lots of English-speaking clients. They couldn't put me in probation, in family training, family services. So I could understand that they would kind of look at my position and think, maybe we should have somebody Chinese in that job. I can quite get that. And that sort of coincided with, I'd passed the bar exams in London, which of course in those days you had to qualify as a barrister in London.
I saw that on your CV, actually, and I couldn't quite understand that if you were living in Hong Kong, why you were qualified in England and Wales.
There was no route in Hong Kong to qualify as a barrister. You had to sit the bar exams in England and be admitted in England and then be admitted in Hong Kong later. And so I think any barristers older than me, and of my era, should I say, in Hong Kong will have gone that route. They'll have qualified in London and then returned to Hong Kong. So I had done that, again, because it was interesting to do. But I continued to work for another year in social welfare after that. And then it was time to do something different. And I thought, well, I've got this qualification. I've been admitted in London. Let's try it. Let's give it a go.
It was a leap of faith.
It was a leap of faith, but quite a big leap at that time, because you give up a paying job. You take on a place in Chambers that you start paying for straight away. So you're paying rent for Chambers, you're paying Chambers expenses, you've got no income from your work because you don't go work straight away, and you've given up a salary. So it was a leap of faith, but sometimes you just have to take them.
And it was that at DeVoe Chambers? You've been there through your whole time?
I was very fortunate. I did pupillage in DeVoe Chambers with Mairead Rattigan, now Mairead Rattigan SC, and did a criminal pupillage also with Michael Pole, who's no longer in practice in Hong Kong, and with David Pilbrow, who's a family barrister. And then I returned to DeVoe as a squatter. I didn't have a room there, but I sort of hung around until they got so sick of seeing me, they thought they might as well give me a room, I think is what happened. And I've been there ever since. So it's really been my home as a barrister.
And you, I imagine, have had mentors there which have helped.
Oh, very much so. I mean, I mentioned Mairead, who, if you ask her, will tell you that she was horrified to have me as a pupil because I was older than she was. And she told me much later that she'd complained bitterly that she had to have me. But actually, it's been fantastic to be in the same chambers as her. Terribly helpful. And it's also good to have somebody. We often work against each other. And that's quite constructive because we can try to smooth off the rough edges of some of the cases.
And so as a pupil, you would have gone into court and had watched barristers
For
do
sure.
the advocacy, and you learn that way. Essentially.
That's the way. That's the traditional way of doing it. I mean, I think nowadays there's far more advocacy training within the training of being a barrister than it was back in my day. I mean, when I was admitted in London, I'd never been into a courtroom. Sit the exams, then you're admitted. That's it.
I find that terrifying. And I must have thought your first time when you go into court on your own.
Yeah. You wouldn't be allowed to do that till you'd done pupillage. But in England, you were admitted through your Inn of Court. You're admitted as a barrister. Then you do your pupillage. So then I suppose is when you're supposed to start, learning what you're supposed to learn. But also in Devo, I was quite fortunate in that people who were doing different kinds of cases would kind of take me along to court with them. So I saw a range of stuff, not just family stuff. So that was very, very interesting. And of course, these are very skilled people, been doing this job for a long time, and they're very good but scary to watch because you think, oh my God, will I be able to do that?
Well, I'm going to come to the topic of the differences between barristers and solicitors. But what do you think really makes a very good advocate?
If I say preparation, that's I think terribly important because you have to be on top of your papers. Whether it's 2 files or 20 files, you need to know what's in your files. So preparation. And of course, you have to understand the case and the law. I suppose commitment to the case you've got. And also, I think you have to be realistic. If you've got a bad case, really, you have to be saying to your client, well, I know this is what you want, but realistically, are you going to achieve that? And that can sometimes be, I think, the hardest role is having people accept the limitations of what a court can do. Because you may have a very frustrated husband or wife complaining about the other party, thinking, I just want the judge to make the order. Well, okay, judge can make the order, but that is not going to change the personality of the person you're dealing with. If it's a difficult and obstinate other parent, they're likely to remain difficult and obstinate. And a court order will give you a framework that will give you some protection. But this is a person you have to deal with realistically over your children until your children are 20, 21, 25, whatever it might be. So I think you have to assist your clients in being realistic as to what they can expect from the outcome. Because give people aspirational views of something that simply can't be achieved, I don't think that helps anybody.
We've both heard various judges use the expression, I haven't got a magic wand.
I've got a magic wand, exactly. And it's for absolutely sure. And nowadays I find judges say that first off. There you go into court the very first time. Do you know what this is going to cost if you keep fighting? Do you know how it's going to harm your children? And I haven't got a magic wand. And all of those things are true.
And so you've had a very long career at the bar, and I've instructed you on many occasions and have seen you in court, and you are a very formidable advocate, undoubtedly. But what actually I think sets you apart in your approach is I've also seen you be incredibly kind to clients. And so why do you think that's an important quality in a barrister?
When you meet people as a solicitor or a barrister for the first time, particularly I think as a barrister, because solicitor, you could meet people who've got quite straightforward matters as well as very complex. And so some people you see can be dealt with quite efficiently and quickly, others will take longer. By the time people come to me, they've had a very difficult road. And actually, I was thinking about this a few days ago. Do you know the first line of Anna Karenina? All happy families are the same, but all unhappy families are different in a different way. So there's always something different. Every client you meet, there's something different about them, about their case. But they're all at a crisis in their lives. It's always something. It might be their children. That's, of course, the most critical. Money, divorce. The divorce is the end of your expectation of your future. It's a massive thing to happen to people. And they're at a crisis. And I think they do sometimes need people just to say to them, it's okay, well, tell me about it and we can understand it. Then let's see what we can do about it. Maybe that comes from having a social work background. Because I've been accustomed over the years to dealing with people in crisis in their lives. And so this is kind of a continuation of that. Obviously, the role is entirely different. But I think it's important to be kind to people in any walk of life.
I think one of the things that perhaps people don't appreciate about a divorce situation is the crisis that people are going through, and how perhaps they can't recollect things the same. And we hear clients talk quite a lot about the truth. And of course, they have their truth.
Of course.
And their spouse will have their own truth.
Yeah.
And one of the phrases which I really like, and I think applies to family law, is of the late Queen, who says recollections may vary.
Yes, exactly. Yes, and I think that's absolutely right. Everyone's got their own truth. And things that are perfectly acceptable in a together family, even though they might be a little bit quirky, are the kind of things that are raked up in a divorce. And I think of that. My daughter told me about her husband, who was taking one of my grandchildren to the beach. And he'd forgotten to take a towel, but he had taken a hat, and he didn't have this, but he had taken that. And they came back sort of tired and sandy after a couple of hours on the beach, having had a lovely day. And so she was kind of laughing at his inefficiency. Forgive me, Tim, for saying that. But she said if she wanted to divorce him, she'd be citing that as evidence of his carelessness, of his negligence as a parent. Yet when they're together, he's a lovely daddy who wants time with his child.
Certainly people come through the divorce process with a different lens. And they do tend to, I feel, probably because it's a time of crisis, to look at things through a very negative lens.
Yes.
And I think part of our job is to remind them about the past, at the time where there was a positive lens, and they would have seen things exactly the same things happening, but they would have viewed it positively.
In a positive lens, exactly. I was in court the other day when a very wise judge said to my client and the other client on the other side, parenting is difficult. Nobody can say parenting is easy. And even if you're together as a family, there can be lots of disagreements, whether it's about healthcare, should the child be vaccinated or not, education, religion. All of these things can be differences within an intact family. So you have to solve them out. You have to solve them one way or another, whether you're together as a family or you're separated. But when you're separated as a family, then it becomes a legal battle. And that's when it becomes, you've seen it, we've seen it together. It can become extremely ugly.
It can, and the professionals involved can be partly responsible for that.
For sure, for certain, sure. Which comes back to the point I was making or trying to make earlier, that having reasonable expectations is, I think, very important for the clients. And if they're told you can achieve the sun, moon and the stars when clearly they can't, then it makes it actually impossible to come to the negotiating table or to mediation or to any dispute resolution, because they've got completely unrealistic expectations, which may well have been engendered by the advice they've been given.
I know clients have been very grateful for me in doing what they call throwing a bucket of cold water over them.
And I've seen you do it. And it's an important thing to do, to say to somebody, well, I know we're going to court next week and you want this, that, and the next thing, but you're not going to get it. We'll do this meantime. This will be our goal. This will be our timeline. We'll work for this, but you ain't going to get it next week, no matter how much you want to. Which means when you go to court next week and they don't get what they want, they're prepared for it. It's not a massive rush of disappointment because what they expected isn't happening. Being realistic in your expectations, I think, is tremendously important.
And I think another thing about communication is it's so important, and making sure the parties are able to communicate early, I think. And so early mediation is something that I do push for. But also the communication between the solicitors involved can have a huge effect. And I think it's helpful for people to understand really how the court views a more aggressive style of communication.
Yes, indeed. Again, this is something I've come across recently where a judge gave a very stern warning to one of the solicitors involved, saying if the tone of the communication continued the way it had been going, steps would be taken, including costs orders made against the solicitor personally. Solicitors, barristers, all of us are there to try to facilitate and bring about, we have an obligation to do this, the right outcome for children in these matters. We're not there to fight to win. And if you're fighting a corner that's really doesn't bring about the right outcome for a child, and you know it's not the right outcome for the child, then I think you have to sit back very carefully and wonder about what you're doing and why you're doing it. It's not about winning for lawyers. It's about ensuring that the best arrangements are made for these children. And I think everybody in the courtroom has an obligation to try and bring that about.
I mean, the whole concept of winning and losing in family law seems quite foreign to me.
I know it does, because that's not the approach you take. And I've sat with you many times where you have a client who's got, there might be some difficulty in the case, and you own the problem. You don't say, no, this isn't a problem, let's pretend it's not there. You say, okay, we've got this problem. So how do we deal with the problem? And then we can move on. And you have to do that. That's the only responsible approach.
Yeah, I do think that our role as professionals is to get the family through the period of crisis that they're going through and set them on a positive road for the future.
Yes.
Rather than throwing in the bomb and then washing your hands of it.
And leaving people to deal with the aftermath. I mean, I bumped into a woman at some drinks event recently who'd been a client of mine years before. And I had remembered her case, but I wouldn't have picked her out of a crowd, if I can put it that way. And she came and spoke to me. It was really nice to speak to her. And she said that she and her husband have got such a good relationship. He's in a new relationship. She went round to meet the new partner and the baby. Their children go back and forth between the two homes. And I said, it's worked. There was grief at the beginning, but they worked their way through that. And now they have this grown-up, proper relationship that their own children can see them having. How much better is that than kids who are scared to tell their mum they had a good time with dad, or scared to tell their dad mum's got a boyfriend? It's you can see the damage it does to children.
Absolutely. I think that is the sort of nirvana, shall we say, of what families might want to look like. One thing I see is perhaps people being a bit unrealistic about how long that takes and how much work you have to do to get there.
And in this case, I'm talking to you, but it took some years.
Yeah.
People are hurt. Bad things are said, which is why, again, settle your case early on and the bad things don't get said. There's complaints, there's grumbles, but once you start firing affidavits, and again, the judges will say this, once you've sat in a witness box and been cross-examined by your husband or wife's barrister, you will never want to speak to him or her again.
Yes. I think that people don't really appreciate that things get worse.
Oh.
And we spend a lot of time telling our clients that things are going to get worse.
And emotionally worse and financially worse. This is not a cheap business. To take a case through court is a very expensive thing, but the damage it does to you, and it brings your children into it. They have to be interviewed by a social welfare officer. Sometimes they meet the judge. Usually that's if they ask to, or if the social welfare officer will ask, do you want to meet the judge? And they might say yes. Maybe that's a cathartic thing for them, because at least the children can feel they've been heard, which I think is probably important for them. But we all see the damage it does and the hurt it causes, and kids who are confused and mixed up. So, yeah, early mediation. We've got loads of very good mediators in town. Send them off to mediation.
I think that time is a healer. I think that is, it's just true. But if you're using your time as you go away from the separation and you're in litigation, you're not healing during that period.
And we've all got cases where, 5 years down the line, 6 years down the line, people are still fighting. The children I've got one case, the children are now in their 20s and they're well beyond any orders being made, but there's still fighting going on between the parents. Really? That's not because of that's just because of psychological enmeshment. They can't cut the cord and separate from each other. There's something that draws them into the fight. Negative intimacy, I believe it's called. It's that. How can that be healthy for anybody? Not getting on with your life.
So during your career, you will have noticed a lot of changes, particularly in relation to children cases. And one of the reasons for that might be because the roles that people are playing in children's lives have changed during that period.
I think that's right. Now, I noticed it even walking down the street. Nowadays, I've been here for almost 50 years, and you'd seldom see a father out with children on their own, or with little children, with babies. Nowadays, it's very common. Dads with the babies in the little front carriers of papoose on their own, or taking the toddler by the hand. So I think fathers are playing, and this is just observation on the street, but seeing family friends and things, fathers seem to play a lot greater role in bringing up the children. And it used to be called your dad's babysitting the children. And as one of my nieces says to her mother, he's not babysitting, he's parenting. And that's true. And women expect that. This is not my baby, it's our baby, and we bring them up together. And dads enjoy it once they realise it's not just a job for women. But I think also that's reflected very much in the social welfare reports we see. There used to be children to be with mum. That's kind of the belief in the community. And it was very often reflected in, I think, some of the professional reports, that the normal thing would be for children to be with the mother. And the report would reflect what was happening at home, but also, if you like, almost societal expectations. But I think the social welfare reports we see now are much better than they were, much more thoughtful, much more analysis going into them, and much more recognition of the importance of fathers in the lives of, and particularly young children, not just the 10, 11-year-olds who can speak up for themselves, but for the little children. And I think that's new, and I think it's very, very positive.
I mean, one of the issues I think we see where conflict occurs in children cases is that as a family, there's been a dynamic in the family. And it may well be parents have taken on particular roles, but that's when they're living under the same roof. And that can change, because when you're living separately, people step up, they take on a different role, and it does cause conflict.
It does cause conflict. And it's almost like, and I've referred to this before to clients, like the super dad thing, that the dad who never before would be taking the kids to school or picking them up or taking them into activities, suddenly is doing it. And the mother will say, that's only because he wants to look good in the eyes of the court. And, that may be right. Initially, that may be right. But on the other hand, your child now has a father who's involved. Is that not a benefit? That's a good thing. So maybe having a super dad is a good thing for the kids.
I think the difficulty with that is that probably the pattern before is that one of the parties made a lot of the decisions, and now they're having to make these decisions jointly, and they haven't actually had the skill set to do that at a time where things were looked through the positive lens that we talked about.
Exactly right. They haven't developed the ability to do that. So the person who's used to making those decisions will now be saying, typically he, is interfering with my management of the children. I'm the one who've done all of it. I've always sorted the ECAs. I've done all of this stuff, and now I can't, because he's messing with the timetable and makes life more difficult. Part of the learning curve, I think. You have to learn to parent separately.
And you also have to learn to have a different relationship with somebody who you had been in a romantic relationship with,
for sure,
but now is a co-parent.
Yeah. And you have to, reluctant as some people are, give some credence to the views of somebody else. The kids might be better with tennis rather than football. They may prefer to go swimming rather than fencing or whatever it might be. If you're used to holding the reins of authority or power in respect of the arrangements for the children, it's quite difficult to let that go, both in terms of letting go and also acknowledging that somebody else's views might actually be as worthy as your own.
So we've talked about some changes in the law in relation to children, but actually I reminded myself again when I was looking at your profile on the DeVoe Chambers website that you were part of the team in probably the most well-known family case in Hong Kong, which is LKW and DD, which for those people who don't know, it was Hong Kong's case that changed the law in relation to financial remedies,
yes,
and effectively put in place the starting point of 50-50. And I remember as a 4-year qualified solicitor in London when White and White, the judgment in that case was delivered, and it was just a seismic shift in the law, and Hong Kong had to wait 10 years.
Had to wait until there was a case that would this new approach could be applied to, because previously, as you know, the approach was that no matter how much money typically was in the hands of the husband, even if it had been a joint endeavour to accrue those assets, if they were in the husband's name, the wife would only be entitled to what she reasonably required. She wouldn't be entitled to a share in the assets accrued by the husband, unless, of course, she was a legal owner of them. I mean, the reasonable requirements in a wealthy family might have meant, 2 houses and a set of stables. because that was reasonable in terms of the standard of living the parties had. But all the surplus was kept by the husband. And as you mentioned, the White case, that's when the court said, well, actually, the proper thing is to split things equally between parties, unless there's a good reason not to. And then Hong Kong lagged a long way, as you say, 10 years behind. And the judges did try to approach financial cases in a sort of equal sharing arrangement as best they possibly could. But there needed to be a proper Hong Kong case in the Court of Final Appeal. And DD LKW was the case. And it wasn't a big money case. I think the assets were no more than 5 million. And the parties were both representing themselves at first instance and then at the Court of Appeal. Sort of the word went out within the profession that these people need to be properly represented. The legal arguments need to be presented to the Court of Final Appeal. So can we put together teams to represent both of the parties? And I was one of the teams in that case. On one of the teams, should I say. And it was interesting because we looked at the law in many different jurisdictions. I mean, in fact, the Court of Final Appeal was very ready to say, yes, of course, we're going to adopt, but they had to write the judgment and they needed to be given the ammunition and the research to assist in writing the judgment. But yes, and since that time, how often do we refer to LKW? In every single financial case.
And it is a judgment that has absolutely stood the test of time because when you reread it, it's so well written.
It is extremely well written and it draws on all the important judgments from other jurisdictions and essentially says, yes, things should be 50-50 unless you can persuade the court they shouldn't. And you might persuade the court it shouldn't be because, well, I inherited these assets from my grandmother. I had them before I was married. They weren't accrued through the marriage. And it's all there. Everything you need is in that judgment, which is why, as you say, it stood the test of time. And week after week, day after day, it's referred to in financial cases in the courts.
So I'm going to move on now and we're going to talk about the differences between solicitors and barristers, because I do think that there is a lack of information out there, particularly because different jurisdictions have different systems. And I can well imagine clients wondering why they have to have both of us involved in a case.
Yes, and people ask the whole time, why can't I come straight to you, or why do I need to come to you at all? That would be the two sort of questions. Well, of course, as a solicitor, you're the first port of call. The client comes through your door with the story, the problem, the issue, and you'll then mould the case. You'll be the one who really works out the strategy, how you should be, what needs to be done. First steps, what needs to be done, and can it be achieved through the initial stages as a solicitor, or do you need to have somebody who'll go into court for you, barrister, to do the kind of stand up and arguing kind of part of it?
I think that's one of the main differences, isn't it? It's the skill set, because as a solicitor, we spend a lot of our time with the client doing the paperwork.
Yes,
but we don't necessarily spend a lot of time advocating on our feet. And it is a skill that you need to learn and hone. And that is what you do every day.
Well, that's right. And as you say, you're the one who moulds the case, the strategy of it. But I think it sometimes comes to the point too when you've been in the case some time and realise that it's likely to go to a proper fight and you want a barrister to be involved, then I have always found it very, very helpful in practice if the solicitor is somebody like you and I will do, which is sit in a room with the client and say, okay, well, let's discuss what we need to do here. So it's not just here's a set of papers with an argument, with an affidavit, go to court and argue it. It's let's work out how collectively we think this case should be presented to the court.
I think that might be one of the differences between a client instructing a specialist family solicitor, because when we work with barristers, we work very much in a team and we collaborate together. Whereas I might be wrong, but I think that if a client goes to a solicitor who's more a general general practitioner, they won't necessarily be very hands-on in a family case.
I think that's very true, which is why I say it's really helpful to be able to sit down with the team, with solicitor, client, and anybody else on your team who's involved, and work out how we progress, as opposed to somebody who doesn't know the approach of a family court, has no experience with that, and doesn't have much to offer in terms of what can we expect from the court outcome. That kind of collaborative discussion can't take place. It did kind of essentially hand the case over to the barrister, as opposed to say to the barrister, "Will you become one of our team?"
Yeah, I mean, we definitely work well together, collaborating, working out strategy for our clients, and a lot of things are judgment calls, and so we discuss those with the client
for sure
and work out the best approach.
And it's a lot of these things. There's no right and wrong. And most things in life, there's no right and wrong. It's just chew it over and see what feels right within the context of the experience of the client, of what they wish the family set up, and chew it over and see what feels what is going to be what we think is going to be the best outcome in the end of the day.
I've had clients who've asked me whether I would do their trial. And frankly, that question sort of fills me with dread. But I think it also probably highlights that perhaps clients don't understand the amount of work that goes in, and also the skill that is required to do an effective cross-examination, which I would put my hand up and say I just don't have that experience.
I think it would be tremendously difficult for a busy solicitor like you to set aside the time to prepare for a trial, for a 4 or 5 day trial. I mean, I would certainly expect to have at least the week before the trial completely set aside, and the weekend before the trial. And of course, lots of time before that as well, because you've already probably been involved in earlier court hearings and looking at documents, at affidavits and court reports and that kind of thing. It's absolutely full-time 24/7 for the whole time you're in court, and for the time before. So it's in terms of time commitment, because that will be the only case I'm involved in for that time. You will have other clients who want your attention. They want to come through your door, have a meeting with you. You'll have other things to prepare for different cases to go to court. I won't have that for that time.
I mean, the time is one of them, but also it's just skill. I mean, I've seen you cross-examine in court, and it really is something to behold.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. We must have been there on a good day. This comes back to something you asked in the beginning, and it's about knowing your papers. I think that's got an awful lot to do with it. Because if you do know your papers, then you can think on your feet. You're not scrabbling around trying to find out what the response to something should be. Or maybe it comes back to Dad always saying I was argumentative for the cross-examination point. Yes, I don't know. I'm quite sure if you wanted to do it, you could.
Well, again, it's a skill that you can learn.
Of course, I think that's right. That's right. Yeah, and you practice it, and you hone the skill, and you realise what you did wrong. And I remember years ago talking to a London silk who was out here helping on one of my cases. And somebody said to him, well, when you leave court, do you still, he's a very, very experienced guy, when you leave court after your trials, do you still worry about what you did through the day? He said, of course I do. I go home and I think about it, for ages, because that's how you learn. That's how you get better. What did I do wrong? What did I do right? What should I have done? Should I have said that or not said that? And I think all the barristers I know who do my kind of work will tell you they wake up in the middle of the night haunted by something that happened in court, thinking, oh my God, should I have said this? Should I not have said that? It's just, it goes with the territory, I think. And if it doesn't, if you're not thinking that at the end of the day, that seems to me to be a bit unusual.
They do talk about adrenaline and saying about, healthy adrenaline is what you need. Because if you don't have any adrenaline, that's when you should worry.
Oh, I think that must be right. I mean, it's scary every time. Does anybody not have adrenaline? I don't know. Do you ever see it?
Well, it's difficult to tell, isn't it? Because professionals doing their job,
They look composed.
They look very composed.
Yes.
But sometimes the feet are going very fast under the water.
I suppose like what is it, the swan or the duck looking calm above water and the feet are paddling. Yeah, I think maybe exactly that.
So you've been involved in too many cases to remember, I would imagine, but there must be some cases that have left their mark on you.
Yes, some I remember kind of with a smile and some with respect for the people involved. Well, I mean, most of the latter, of course. One I remember that always makes me smile and slightly chuckle when I think about it was when we had an interpreter in court, and one of the clients, the other party, kept on interfering and interrupting the interpreter because he wanted the interpretation to be more in favour of his case. He didn't like the answer that the witness was giving and was trying to reinterpret it for the interpreter. So there ended up being a screaming match between the interpreter and the other party. And unbeknownst to either of them, the judge spoke the language in question. So it ended up being a complete circus on a Friday afternoon. And that was one that I think of as just like a bizarre happening. But in terms of cases that kind of stick with me as things that I remember, one case in particular where a little girl she must have been 5 or 6, her father was trying to make her say that the mother abused her. And it was a very domineering father. Gosh, he was domineering. The kids were scared of him. But this little girl, the siblings were different. They were still a bit scared of him. But this little girl said resolutely to anybody who would listen to her, "My mummy doesn't hurt me. He keeps telling me to say that she does, but my mummy doesn't hurt me." And I think, now, man, what courage that child had. That took a lot. He was a big guy. He was loud voice, scary. And I think of that little girl now. She must be 20. What respect, huh? To be able to stand up and do that. But I think of other cases too, where kids have been sufficiently cowed by either by a parent who wants to ensure they have no relationship with the other parent, or by a domineering parent, that there will be kids. We know it. We said it as we started off talking. Damaged for life by the way the damage has been done to them during the litigation. And that's tremendously sad. But I look back on a lot of the cases the work I've done and people I've worked with, actually, generally speaking, with respect for their resilience. And I hope that most of them, not because of my efforts, but because of their own, I hope most of them kind of come through and think, well, that's in the past and I'm now moving forward. Because we know the old rule, a happy life is the best revenge.
Absolutely. I do say that to my clients.
Yes.
We find clients very, very focused on their spouse. And a lot of the time, and a rule of litigation is focus on your own case and focus on yourself and your own well-being.
Yes. And as I say, there was a client came in to see me, an old client, it must be more than 10 years ago, now living in America. And she came back to Hong Kong to visit. One of her children was living here. And she just dropped, I was in chambers and I got a call to say this woman was in reception. And she'd been a woman who'd had a very domineering husband who'd sworn that he would never give her a penny. And indeed, after she left Hong Kong, he didn't. She got some assets out of him, but she never, ever, ever got paid any maintenance. So she went back to where she came from. She went to university, she got a degree, she got a job. She bought a house. She was happy. And she was a perfect example of living a happy life is the best revenge. She just said, I'll look after me. I'm not going to spend my days fighting him, going through courts. I'll look after myself. And it was great for her to do it because she never had been able to do that in the past. I thought it was fantastic. I was very proud of her.
Now I'm going to ask you a difficult question then. So,
right.
When you look at your own career, what are you most proud of in your career?
Can I say survival? Is that the right answer?
Resilience.
Yes, resilience. I'm pleased that I enjoy what I do and that I'm still doing it. And funnily enough, you started off asking about, my father having thought I should be a lawyer when I was younger. I think actually he'd be proud. I think he'd be pleased. Mum certainly was. I suppose, as they say, I'm proud to still be standing, still be doing it.
You certainly have a curiosity for it, otherwise you wouldn't be doing it.
I think you have to have. If it doesn't matter, I think if you're working with ships or with companies, it's all very interesting and academic and intellectual. Do you really care? Obviously, you care about the outcome because it's your profession and you have a professional obligation to do your best, and people want to do their best in that. But do you actually care about the ship? Probably not so much. But I think in our work, and you have exactly the same thing. Solicitor or barrister makes no difference. You really have to care about the outcome. It's not a paper exercise because there are people at the end of it, which is partly why lots of people in my chambers, the people who do commercial work, would say, do not ask me to do a family case. I went into the family court once. I'm never going in again. It was terrible. People were crying. I'm not doing it. You've got to be prepared to deal with that and to think, well, yeah, it matters. It does matter. And you care about the outcome.
So looking at the younger generation of family lawyers, one of the concerns I have is we do see people leaving the profession because, in actual fact, it is a difficult job and you do need a lot of resilience for it. But in a law firm, the younger solicitors are part of a team and they can be mentored and they can be supported. But it might be quite lonely as a junior family barrister.
I think that could be right. Dover Chambers is now very, very big. We've got, I think, 100 members. To my shame, I don't know a lot of them, but I think there's quite a lot of support, kind of collegiate support among the younger end of the members of Chambers, but not many of them are family lawyers. I think it's certainly true that you do need to have some kind of is support the right word? I suppose it must be.
Or community as such.
Yeah. Well, yes. And of course, as a barrister, you can get that from your solicitor because you're working with a solicitor very closely over these cases. You've got the same goal, you've got the same ambition for the case, you know the same glitches with it, you know the same issues or problems that might be cropping up. So to that extent, yes. But some of the cases and the outcomes and the things that happen are pretty miserable and unhappy. And that can be very hard to deal with. So there have been talks to the Family Law Association here from people who, and I think particularly some woman from London, and also at a conference I attended in London, saying all people doing this kind of work should have a very, very secure and structured support network. It may be that you have somebody you go and talk to once a week, once a month about your work, somebody with whom really you can let off some steam. To an extent, I have that in Chambers. I've got people who do my kind of work in Chambers, and we can have a good grumble after work. More likely it would be with a solicitor who's involved in the case. But it's I quite often have young people in Chambers who are doing family work, and there aren't so many of them, but there's some, will come and knock on my door and want to ask things about the case. But that's more like, what should I do about this problem, as opposed to, I've had a terrible day and I don't know how to get beyond it. So maybe actually what we should be doing within Chambers, now that I think about it, and I've never thought about this before, is sort of put out some feelers to those of us who've been doing the work for some time, put out some feelers to the younger people who are doing family work and say, okay, would you like us to have every couple of weeks, have a coffee get together or a glass of wine on a Friday, or, would you like us to do something to form some kind of group of people interested in this kind of work? Actually, that really might be worth doing, because we've got a very dynamic practice development manager now within Chamber. She's great, and I think if I discussed it with her, she'd be exactly the kind of person who would say, okay, well, let's put out some feelers and see if there's interest for that, because I think that would be really worthwhile doing. Actually, I've never thought about it before.
I mean, I think definitely the profession has changed. When I started out, it was very much stiff upper lip, and you just had to cope. And it's difficult work, and I feel it's moved on now. And I don't think you just have to be a robot and cope with these sorts of things.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, it's exactly what you say. We should, rather than have people just come and randomly knock on your door and say, "Can I ask you about this?" If there was something, like I say, Friday, of course, everybody's busy or out of court through the day, but whatever, 5:30 on a Thursday, let's get together and have half an hour together. I think that might be really worthwhile doing. It is stressful work.
It is stressful work.
Because what happens in these courtrooms changes people's lives. It changes their relationship with their children. It changes their financial outlook. It changes their expectation for the future. And they have already lost what they expected to be their future. The marriage is gone. They're sharing their children as opposed to living with their children full time. They don't have the financial resources they had before. All of these things have changed. And it's enormous for them, huge for them. And inevitably has a knock-on effect on the people who are working with them, in terms of, if it's a bad outcome, an outcome you had hoped not to happen, it can be pretty depressing, actually. And we've all had days of leaving court thinking, oh my God, that's, I don't want to talk about this ever again. This is the last time I'm talking about this case. The kind of feeling that you've just...
Well, that's one of the things that we do say to our clients, is that to avoid those types of situations, to control the process, don't leave it in the hands of a judge, and try to find alternative dispute resolution methods of resolving their disputes.
And of course, as judges will say time and time again, if you mediate and you reach an outcome you can live with, at least you control that outcome. If a judge decides, you've got no control. You might get what you want, but you might get nothing that you want. At least with mediation, it's a bit like being in the market. You can bargain. I'll give you this if you give me that, and we can cooperate in this way. And so it will be something you can live with.
I mean, I've been really taken by times we've been in court and we might have quite big legal teams on either side. And so there's a lot of legal brains in court. And then the judge will say something that nobody in the courtroom thought of or expected. And so you're out of control in that time.
Yes. I mean, for absolutely sure. And the judge will say, well, if you want me to decide, I'm going to decide something neither one of you wants. Or, it might be something both of you hate. So why don't you go outside and work out something that will be manageable for both of you? Because it can often be such a small thing the fight is about. Will the pick-up of the child be at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock on a Friday? Can it be Tuesday rather than Wednesday? These are not life-changing events in the big picture. But in the moment, for the client, they seem like they're massive. Then to fight over those things just seems to be destructive.
I think one of the more difficult areas that we deal with, which is cases involving relocation of children. I mean, they are the very, very difficult cases. And I know that you've actually had a personal experience of this recently, because your beloved grandchildren have left Hong Kong.
They have. And my daughter was unkind enough to leave Hong Kong, where she was born and brought up, and take my grandchildren with her. She sometimes calls me and says, do you want them back? Because they're driving me mad. But they've lived close to me for all of their lives. But she went to live in England a couple of years ago. And I was brokenhearted for them all to go, not just the grandchildren.
It must have given you a view about what our clients go through in those cases.
I can only say I got the tints of it, because it felt to me like it was my heart broken, but they weren't even my children. So how does it feel if they are your children? And you're used to seeing them every week and suddenly they're across the world. On the other side of that, I look at the arrangements they now have and I think that was the best thing for them. I mean, I even admit that to my daughter, that you did the right thing. The kids are happy, they're settled, and I'm only their grandmother. I'm not their mother or their father. And of course, I'm sure I'd feel differently, but I can see that there's when you see that it's been a good move, it's been the best thing. And this is what judges have to do. They have to weigh up. Is this going to be the best thing for these children? They are going to lose the daily or weekly contact with the other parent, but there will be the holidays. And it's always said, well, now we can do FaceTime. Yeah. FaceTime's not a cuddle, is it? It's not a book at bed. Well, it can be a book at bedtime, actually. That's the smart thing. If you say to the kids, okay, you buy this book and I've got this book here, we'll read it together. Even though it's in FaceTime, it's better than nothing. It really is better than nothing. So it's a very difficult kind of application, a very difficult principle. But then what do you do if you're a lot of my clients would be people who've come to Hong Kong because of the marriage or the other party's job. Marriage breaks up. So why am I remaining in Hong Kong? Just because of somebody else's job? I suppose the answer to that might be, well, you can go if you want to, but the kids can't go. It's a tough one. And of course, because Hong Kong is such an international city, I think we probably have more cases, a higher proportion of relocation cases than lots of other places would have.
Oh, I think we also have incidents of international marriages.
Yes.
And so in those cases, if the relationship ends, you might have one party who wants to go to England and the other party wants to go to New Zealand.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And you've got three different places involved. American meets an English person in London and they move to Hong Kong. So where's the family base? It's it's problematic. It really is. And there's no perfect answer, is there?
Yeah, there certainly isn't.
And it's difficult to know if the relocation takes place, it has to be on the basis that the absent or the left behind parent is having as much of the holiday time as you possibly can. Of course, if you're a working parent, it's difficult. You can't take 3 months off a year necessarily to spend time with your kids. Or it has to be an acceptance. So, okay, the kids will come back and see the Hong Kong parent. And it may be some of that time they'll be in a day camp or they'll be with a helper. You can't expect the working parent to have all of that holiday each year. It's difficult. They're really, really difficult cases. And somebody's heart is going to be broken as a result of the outcome.
One of the things I don't really like that people say about Hong Kong, but there might be an element of truth to it, is that it's the graveyard of marriages.
Maybe, yeah. I think it used to. Is it still? Do people still say that?
I think they might say that, but I think part of it may be because Hong Kong is such a international, vibrant place. Mm-hmm. Perhaps couples come and then they change in ways that are different from each other and they grow apart.
That could be right. Graveyard of international marriages. You mean yeah? I really don't know. So many of the people I have worked with recently, there might be an international marriage, but people who both intend to remain in Hong Kong. If it's not relocation, they both intend to be here. But the marriage has broken down here because of relocation or just because they would have done anyway. I really don't know. I don't know.
Well, perhaps people are looking around the rest of the world these days and thinking there aren't necessarily better places to be.
Oh, you'd have to look incredibly hard to find somewhere better. I mean, I think you should look around the world and be absolutely terrified of what you can see and think, in that case, I'm staying in Hong Kong. I don't plan to leave. I mean, where looks better at the moment? I spend my whole days being completely terrified about what I see. around the world. So Hong Kong, I think, is a fabulous place. I've always loved Hong Kong. I love the Hong Kong people. They've got a spirit, they've got a resilience, they've got the hard working, I think it's a great place to be.
We're going to wrap up now, but actually you've just sort of led me to perhaps the advice that you would give to young family lawyers. And all of the things you just said is really what they will need to have. They need to have resilience, they need to work hard, they need to have a passion.
I think that's true. But you mentioned earlier that, the young people who leave the profession. I've known quite a few young solicitors who've done a few years as family solicitors and then said, I'm done with this. I can't deal with the unhappiness. Of course, there are solicitors who are getting it. They're the first port of call for the clients, so it may be different for them. But I think if you have to be able to deal with that unhappiness without letting it overwhelm your life, because I think it could lead you to feel really miserable all of the time, which is no way to live your life. And those are the people who will then say, fine, I'm going in-house, I'm going to work for somebody, I'm not doing this kind of work anymore. Now, if that's how you feel, then it's a decision to make, the right decision. Do something else, do something different. I think you have to care about the outcome. And that's not coming from kind of my social work side, it's coming from the realistic side.
And you have to care about people.
Yeah, and if you didn't, go work with a ship, Yeah, I think you do have to. You have to care about the people. You have to care about your clients, and you have to care about getting the best outcome.
Well, thank you very much for your time. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you for asking me.
Tune in and listen to more episodes of the Hip Talks podcast by checking the Insights section at www.hugelandip.com and the dedicated channels on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcast and Stitcher. They are also available on Hugel and Ip's YouTube channel. You can send comments and feedback to the email address hello@hugelandip.com. Please share the Hip Talks with friends, family and business associates. This podcast is for informational purposes only. Its contents do not constitute legal or professional advice.